Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the third research seminar, postgraduate research seminar between the RCA and the CVC at Royal Holloway. Great to see so many people, and I know there'll be more coming. We're going to try and start on time, more or less, and keep to time. We have the presenters here ready to go. I've put in the chat the lineup, the agreed lineup, which does include also the mini break and the comfort break for the second hour. I've also put in the chat the original link that I sent out, which includes then the names, the bios, and the abstracts, or at least descriptions of the projects being presented today. What I haven't put there, because they weren't available, at least all of them anyway, are the titles. So the presenters will present titles for their presentations. My job is simply to keep things ticking over here. Teal and I have worked together. We've agreed we're going to try and keep on time to maximize discussion in the Q&A. Therefore, we'll go straight through the presentations, all 6 of them. If there are any immediate pressing questions, we can perhaps tackle a few in the mini break after the first 3 presentations. People can put their questions or comments in the chat, and we can come back to the chat as soon as we begin the Q&A. But I think the aim is to make sure that we give all the presenters enough time, and we can sort of confidently move into an extended Q&A, which is going to be interesting for all of us here. So the record button is on, and I would ask people then to mute and also turn off their camera, except for the presenters, please. So our first presenter then is Max Fletcher. Max, it's over to you.
Hi, so you can share the screen. Is that working?
It is. That's perfect.
See, slideshows it. Okay, so my presentation is going to be on text and image relations in Elsa Morante's children's fiction. So just to introduce myself, I'm Max. I'm a first-year PhD student part-time at Royal Holloway. I'm studying in the comparative literature department. My background, sort of prior to this, is in art. I think there's a lot of overlap between the two. So I think maybe this image here is a nice image to start with. The image is a poster for a performance that took place last summer in Rotterdam. It consisted of a stage reading or a translation of one of Elsa Morante's children's stories, when Puma knocked out his friend Massimo. For me, working with stories such as this one was the starting point for my PhD research. Initially an art project, it opened the space to explore the texts, images in the books, Morante's books, amongst others, in more detail. So this text, when Puma knocked out Massimo, first appeared in Elsa Morante's children's book collection, Straordinaria Avventure di Caterina, which was a collection of short stories, some of which were published in the 1930s in children's journals. The first book edition was published in 1942 before being expanded and republished in 1959. So I thought, for me, I guess originally, to gain a little bit more context, I think kind of learning a language, in this case Italian, was something I started learning a few years ago as an adult. And I sort of sought out writers or children's books by writers I'd already read in translation. So Elsa Morante was a favorite. I'd read lots of her other literature, and the discovery that she'd written this children's book was sort of was an entry point into kind of reading things in Italian several years back. Secondly, I think children's literature often combines text and image in ways that literature, large or more generally, doesn't. Coming from a background in art that combines also text, text and image, or textual and visual elements, this felt important. So this was a collaboration. This print was a collaboration with another artist, Andrea Celeste Laforgia, translating the play into a short play script. So that's just a little bit of context. I'll move on. So this image here is the cover for Jacqueline Rose's book, The Case of Peter Pan, or The Impossibility of Children's Fiction. In it, Rose, so the image is of the book cover, and in the book, sorry, in the book, Rose argues that children's literature is an impossible genre. It's inherently rooted in adult fantasy. Although Rose's book takes J.M. Barrie's 1904 text, Peter Pan, as its subject matter, her study extends beyond this one book and responds to the general assumption that children's literature is written for the child. Rose argues that rather than addressing children's needs, these books, in fact, tend to satisfy the needs and desires of adults. For Rose, children's literature makes problematic assumptions about the child. In general, the genre tends to produce an adult idea of childhood, creating an image of the child inside the book that the child outside the book isn't encouraged to emulate or to copy. Rose's interest is less how the child responds to what she refers to as a solicitation or chase, but rather how the adult's projection of childhood purity becomes entrenched in both the genre of children's literature, but also critical works on the genre. Addressing the child as part of a unified group, defined above all by innocence and simplicity, fails to account for race, class, culture, education, or any other number of factors that might shape one's childhood. It's like a little bit of context on some of the stuff that I'm going to explore within Morante's fiction. So slide 3, this image contains a scan of the opening page to Morante's collection. Above the text is a drawing. It depicts a framed portrait. A sitter with curly hair faces the reader. Either side is a cat. The text below the portrait sets up the book's framework. It tells us that the writer, Elsa Morante, was roughly 13 years old when the stories were written. She describes how she had no publisher. Her audience consisted of just 2 cats and a certain number of younger brothers and sisters. As the image shows us, the cats were of different size but equal importance. This page is important for the context it provides. From the first moment, it tells us we're not dealing with the projections of an adult, but rather the writings of a 13-year-old child, a 13-year-old. While Morante was around 30 years old when the book was published, it is fair to assume that they were edited as an adult. The framework of the stories come from her experiences growing up under fascism. I won't have time to go into all the stories, or indeed any of the stories in too much detail, but I will try and briefly outline some of the context and what the implications might be. The stories themselves, I argue, are inherently political, dealing with the hardship and poverty of many families under fascism. The search for a good meal is a constant, set in the narrative in both the titular Caterina collection, where Caterina's hunger drives the narrative, taking her on a set of adventures, and in the second story, featured in my opening slide, when Puma knocked out Massimo. In this story, Puma and Massimo, both starving, stage a boxing match with the aim of tricking a local millionaire into placing a large bet on the favourite Massimo. The match is, however, rigged, and the underdog Puma, literally meaning feather in Italian, wins. When a third party steals their winnings, they embark on a new career as travelling umbrella salesman. So I hope I have a little time to explore a couple of moments from both stories as I posit a kind of playful and experimental in both their use of language, text, and or image. So first, I'm going to look at another slide from Caterina. So this image is from the same collection. It's from Caterina's Adventures, and in it, Caterina and her sister argue over a meal. Rosetta, the older sister, explains that she's currently between jobs. She cannot afford even a loaf of bread. The image depicts Caterina in tears as Rosetta ends up her socks, one of the various things she does for work. So the image we see in the center of the page, surrounded by text, feels playful. It's as much a doodle as an illustration. It's got a sense of marginalia to it. It's definitely kind of has a certain speed. The accompanying text is direct and also playful. Rosetta's answers are abrupt and to the point as Katerina gradually downsizes her demands. The passage starts. I'm a little hungry. Can you give me a plate of roast meat with a side, Rosetta? Not today. I don't have much work. In this country, kids grow up quickly and no one needs me to watch them. They've learned to mend their own socks. It will come to be that even the soil digs itself. Yes, I understand, Rosetta. I eat a side, eat meat without a side. I don't think I can, Kateri. The winter has come, and no one calls me to water the garden. Richo's mum no longer needs a babysitter, as he's learnt to blow his own nose. I could just have a side salad without any meat. There's no salad. A small loaf. It's not possible. Or half a loaf. There isn't any. A mouthful. Not even. Half a mouthful. Rosetta sighed. So, switching back to Rose quickly, her conclusion addresses the role of modernism in children's fiction, asking why the genre has typically resisted modernism. In critical terms, she suggests that alongside experimental film, modernist experimentation in children's fiction sits at the bottom of the list of acceptability as far as public consciousness is concerned. This response is in part due to a widespread belief that children need regulation of the narrative form. I'd suggest that the passage above, the haggling over a meal, feels like an exemplary modernist passage from the heightened language to the desire for some sort of truth. I'm going to move on to a final image, which deals, it's an image also from the book. So this last image shows another page from Morante's Caterina collection. It's accompanying the story. The image accompanies the story when Puma knocked out his friend Massimo. Rather than a straightforward illustration, it serves as a sort of map of the story's events. So we can see in the image in the center, there's a boxing match that gives the story its title, and other events that make up the narrative surround the central image. So we've got, we can kind of see, and I'll describe it a little bit more. So it's a strange image. It's a sort of map. As Puma stands triumphantly over the knocked out Massimo. We see the millionaire to the right, Puma Massimo, wearing an extended top hat and waving his money. We see the robber to the right of the millionaire about to steal Puma Massimo's winnings. We see the referee with a stopwatch. Details go on. Most of the surrounding details refer to the narrative, to the story, but others, pure invention, between invention and reality. Furthermore, the trickery at play in the staged fight, there's a sort of distinct neorealist sensibility to it, the desire to platform the day-to-day struggles of working people and the unemployed. I think probably wrapping up towards the end now. So I think in wrapping up, I propose that Morante situates the child as writer, embracing both modernist experimentation in both text and image form, all of which provide a path forward that steers children's fiction away from some of the problematic norms of the genre. How's that for time? Is that?
Yes, Max. That's. Are you done now?
I think I'm. Yeah, I think I'm done. If that's. If is that roughly 10 minutes?
That's roughly 10 minutes. That's perfect. Thank you.
Shall I? I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. That's great. And I respect you keeping on time. That set up some questions, I'm sure, for a discussion on modernism, children's literature, and text and image. But we now move to, I think, something quite different with Cam Rehal from the RCA. I think we're moving to the present and to the outside, but you will tell us, Cam. So over to you now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Sorry.
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. Okay,
So,
thank you. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, the title of my research is Collaborative Mark Making and Conversation, Durational Acts for Making and Sharing Critical Impressions through Allotments and Growing Spaces. It's a practice-based PhD, and I'm in my 6th year part-time study. And what I'm researching is the connections between the practices of drawing and mark making and those of the allotment or shared growing space. And I'm thinking about how the research might facilitate a generating of dialogue with members of growing groups. I'm a graphic designer. I teach and practice graphic design, and sort of my main point of focus has been publishing in exhibition environments within arts and cultural spaces. And what I've been really interested in is how people relate to an environment and how they also consider how space informs experience. So I'm just gonna, sorry, let's jump across. So in 2020, I joined an allotment group in Tunbridge in Kent, where I live. And at that time of joining, the main sort of point of conversation with plot holders or those who sort of inhabit the allotment space was Brexit. That was our sort of main point of conversation. But very quickly, it was replaced by COVID and the pandemic as the sort of staging of conversation. And I've been finding ways to try and research the site, both through design methods, but also thinking about conversations and interviews with members of the allotment group. And what I've started with was one-to-one conversations, and then this expanded to small group dialogues. So this kind of slide shows the sort of breakdown of the main kind of processes or stages of the research. So the initial approach, I've developed a method called collaborative mark making and conversation, and it's a way of sort of approaching other allotment groups beside my own. And what it does is it kind of unites drawing and dialogue within sort of relationship to each other within particular contexts. And those contexts are a sort of mixture of the growing environment itself, working with participants who are from a growing community, and for a durational event, a research moment. And this is a way for us to think through allotments and shared growing spaces. And what this is generating are co-articulations of perspectives, issues, knowledges, and experiences which intersect and relate to allotments and shared growing practices. And then finally, this is brought together, composed within an ethnographic account, which is both multimodal and multi-site. And what the account does is it produces what I'll refer to as a community and process across allotments and shared growing spaces. So I'll use this presentation to sort of unpack that. On screen here are some sort of images of the kind of key snapshots of the process of collaborative mark making and conversation. So what this entails is I launched an open call inviting members of allotment groups to participate in research dialogues. And so what I do is I visit an allotment site equipped with a large sort of drawing board, which is a large wooden panel, and it's been poured, a layer of plaster of Paris has been poured onto this panel, and we work with small tools, wooden dowels, and together we draw into the surface, and we also then generate both drawing and conversation together, which relates to our experiences of allotments and shared growing spaces. And then after the sort of research event, I take a rubbing of the drawing, which is a charcoal drawing, onto tissue paper. And then once that sort of record of the drawing is established, I'll pour a fresh layer of plaster of Paris onto the surface in order to reactivate that surface and make it ready for another conversation. So what I've done is I've made a short film as a sort of way of demonstrating these various stages. So you'll see 3 stages of the film. The first part is me preparing the surface, and the next is a sort of a demonstration of an allotment group coming together to draw into the surface, and finally a rubbing of the drawing itself. So I'm just going to press play on this, and as it's playing, I'll just talk through the rest of the research. And I'll just turn the volume down, actually. This. Here we go. So allotments, right? Okay. So allotments are deeply political. They've got their roots in the Enclosures Acts of the 1700s, which made previously common land private and prevented access to it. Industrialization saw sort of mass movements of populations leaving agricultural work in order to enter cities and urban environments to take up new sort of forms of working and living. And historically, there's a sort of various social reformers and wealthy landowners saw allotment gardening as a way of instilling a culture of hard work or moral health, or as a means to try and connect what they perceived, so correct what they perceived were social disorders within the working poor. And basically, as a way of sort of keeping people busy so that their minds and bodies will be switched off from potential political organizing. So the allotments model generally operates in a very similar way to its very beginnings, in that it's a reappropriation of land, usually unwanted or wasteland, which doesn't really serve other purposes. And it's allotted in small parcels to individuals for growing and producing food. And traditionally, the system doesn't really encourage a sense of sort of social purpose or social uses. And it also still to this day continues to sort of emphasize or place emphasis on production or a productive use of land for growing. However, and counter to this model, since its very beginning, allotments and sites of shared growing have bred dissenting movements. And so these include calls for improved working and living conditions for tenants, for greater healthcare, particularly with regard to availability of fresh food, and also the rights to roam freely and access land, which is otherwise prohibited. My own experience of allotments, particularly in relation to the kind of periods of Brexit and COVID when I first joined, were that they're a vital space for social and political discourse within the context or background of growing. So I developed a conversational methodology to try and understand different models and how these operate across different sites across the UK. So one of the questions I ask in the research is, how might the collaborative art making approach open up dialogues with members of shared growing groups? And so the work is informed by David Boehm's work on dialogue, and Boehm encourages sort of entering into dialogue with what he refers to as a relative purpose. And so that's not trying to convince someone of your a sort of particular perspective, but trying to think about how to generate new understanding, new dialogue with those who are sort of participating within that experience. And the approach moves away from a sort of traditional interview process of asking questions to one which is about sort of sharing perspectives so that they might be added to, analyzed, challenged, or perhaps related to in terms of the experiences of other participants who are also engaged. What the collaborative art making approach establishes is a deprivileging of speaking alone to place emphasis on making space for gestures and movements, but also listening and processing the presence and contribution of others within a group. So what I suggest is that collaborative art making conversation, I suggest it as a repurposing or a holding of space temporarily alongside others within the plot holding community. And the word community or the term community is a very sort of loaded and problematic term, but I borrow from sort of French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy's understanding of community, which suggests that community doesn't have to be some sort of reinvention or backward-looking endeavor. Nancy writes that community has not taken place. And he continues that community, far from being what society has crushed or lost, is what happens to us in the wake of society. So rather than celebrating some sort of stable notion of community, Nancy encourages that we take it as a matter of thinking community, of thinking its insistent and possibly still unheard demand beyond sort of communitarian models. So a second question I'm going to leave that hanging for a while, Nancy's sort of terms of community, and I'll come back to those. But the second question I'm asking is, what are the potential synergies between acts of mark making and practices of growing? How do these two things sort of potentially relate to one another? So I argue that the surface or material references the plot. So as you see on the screen here, there's a kind of a literal connection between sort of the mark making zone and that of the growing activities, and both evidence the presence of existing marks, contours, features and textures, but also receive and hold new marks. I also feel that they register the traces of movements and gestures made by implements and tools, whether that's digging or working into and turning over the material. By cutting, carving, revealing, these start to relate to the work of the rake, the shovel, the trowel, the tool, or the implement. And this kind of speaks to what Tim Ingold discusses as movements through and within a landscape, which generate a relational knowledge of space. There's also a rhythmic connection within growing, which relates to seasonal patterns or cycles of growing. And I feel that sort of within this practice, as participants shift around the surface or change orientation, they produce tapping, scraping, blowing, rubbing sounds and temporal actions, which produce different durations of action and event.
Okay, Cam, sorry to
Yes.
interrupt you there. I'm just aware of the time.
Yes.
If you could wrap up soon, please.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry. So the final sort of point of connection between the two, I feel, is a sense of intimacy. So drawing produces an intimacy with the surface of material. Plot holders also refer to growing as a way of getting to know your soil. So the heavy, vigorous and exhausting performances of preparing and cultivating plots shares a connection with the delicate, slow and tender pleasures of seeding and nurturing growing things. So what this suggests is, or what I suggest, is that mark making within the situated environment of a shared growing space produces synergies, which are impressions, connections, relational understandings between these two practices, and that this further supports the conditions for a different mode of dialogue within growing spaces amongst unknown and known members, which may continue beyond the research event. Okay, I will stop there. Apologies for running over time. So you're muted, James.
Thank you. I'll just repeat myself there. Thank you for that. And we move with those questions that you've left in the air floating, which we'll come back to, I'm sure, in the discussion. We move to other sorts of other sets of collaboration, dialogue in a different context with Sara O'Brien from Holloway. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you, James. So I will just share my screen. I just have let's see, where is it going? Great. Okie doke. Yeah, so my presentation is called Manifold Modes of Attunement, Art Writing and its Prepositional Orientations. So I'm just going to have one image, and I'm just going to leave this on the screen while I'm talking. So this is an image that has been a strong presence during my kind of most recent phase of practice, which for me is art writing, which I'll go on to discuss. And I often kind of tend to work with images and objects, artworks or otherwise, when writing, and they variously kind of inform and inflect the writing that I do and the ways that I think about writing, all of which is kind of germane to my presentations. So this felt like a fitting thing for everyone to kind of be able to think with or listen with. So just a quick description of the image. The image depicts a stage-like scene with a variety of boxes, papers, vessels, and fragments scattered in the middle of the floor. On the left hangs a long rectangular blue and white patterned piece of fabric, which has a childlike figure wearing a smock standing to the right of it. On the other side of the image, to the left, there's a large square-shaped piece of brown and white fabric with a repeated pattern of stems, leaves, and flowers hanging from the ceiling. And then two small childlike figures, also wearing smock-like garments, stand to its right-hand side. And there is a crease down the middle of the image that would suggest it resides in a book. So yeah, as for the presentation, I'll begin with a general kind of overview of art writing, definitions, and practices, before moving into my own ideas around the prepositional orientations of art writing as a methodology, and the implications this has for theorizing and practicing art writing more generally. So my practice-based research, and I'm in my first year, focuses on the concerns, methods, processes, and outcomes of the growing field of inquiry and practice termed art writing. So although the term art writing has been in use in various guises for almost 3 decades at least, where generally it's been used as an alternative to kind of more traditional modes or methods in art history and criticism, art writing remains neither fixed in its definition nor in its manifestations. In recent times, when I would suggest the use of the term art writing has been proliferating, it is often used to describe artists' writing, which can take the form of texts written for performance or video, the many ways text and language can be deployed in an exhibition space, or artist books, amongst the many other ways that language and text and writing can figure in an artistic practice. Examples include Katrina Palmer, who has made kind of sound and textual work for gallery spaces and radio, but has also published a variety of works with Bookworks, a publisher specializing in artist books. The most recent of which was the Touch Report, which was the result of Palmer's time as artist in residence at the National Gallery in 2024. Ed Atkins, who is known for his video works and has a large retrospective at Tate Britain at the moment, but he has also published 3 books with Fitzcarraldo, the first of which included kind of many of his video and performance scripts, and there's kind of quite a strong relationship between that kind of visual gallery art practice and the writing that he does. Another example is Helen Martin, who is known for these kind of expansive installations, but who has also published an artist's novel with Prototype and a number of written works in varying guises with the independent publisher Bricks from the Kiln. For the purposes of my research, however, I'm currently working with a more open description or definition of art writing as work that is situated amidst the myriad points of intersection between writing and visual art, by which I mean, it's quite a limited term, art in all of its material, spatial, and sensory forms and manifestations. My focus for this presentation will be on the strand of art writing that offers an alternative to more conventional modes of art criticism or writing on art that is predicated on ideas of judgment, taste-making, or overt interpretation, much of which could be said to establish hierarchical, instrumentalizing, and or didactic relationships between the art and writing, and potentially the audiences or readerships too. So I'm more concerned with the expanded and expansive ways of approaching, communicating, and or communing with art via writing, language, and texts that art writing can provide, the spaces it opens up, and the generative, imaginative possibilities these can offer to readers who may or may not encounter the artworks or exhibitions themselves. Examples of this kind of art writing can be found in the fictocritical texts produced by writers such as Travis Jepson or Estelle Hoy, the ways that the poet, curator, and critic Quinn Latimer uses the performative lecture and curatorial texts as dynamic spaces to engage with art, or how the poet and art writer Lisa Robertson uses the catalogue essay as a space to explore her own concerns, notably in her book Occasional Work and 7 Walks from the Office for Soft Architecture, which itself almost kind of resembles an artist's book rather than being a kind of collection of essays or art writing texts. And that's been kind of a primary focus of my own research at the moment. So by examining these varied examples and through my own practice of art writing, I'm interested in exploring how the varying degrees of proximity that might exist in the encounter with the art object can be harnessed, cultivated, and extended via art writing. I'm considering how one might respond to an artwork from a position of poetic rather than critical distance. That is, instead of stepping back from the work in order to get a clearer view or perspective by which one can ostensibly reflect on it more objectively or critically, one can approach the artwork from different angles, at different levels of scale or proximity, and use language and writing to enter, engage, inhabit, and attune to the manifold spaces that are opened up in the encounter with an artwork. As a means of doing this, I have been developing a methodology that is predicated on adopting various prepositional orientations in relation to art, by which I mean writing around, through, to, from, and alongside, rather than about art. Writing alongside might mean being close to the art, physically, conceptually, emotionally, or otherwise. To be alongside implies a level of solidarity, but it also recognizes a level of distance, less a critical distance than the kind of poetic distance I've already outlined. Less remoteness, detachment, and separation than the symbiotic sufficiency that comes from cooperation and interconnection. After all, as Quinn Latimer writes in a text for an exhibition of work she never saw, distance is a funny thing. With its vicissitudes and vagaries, it can be temporal or geographical or emotional, instructive or paradoxical, even dialectical. It can be a physical fact and an intellectual misnomer. What does it name anyway? Distance. One might think of writing through as sieving one set of concerns, the writers, through those of another, the artists as they manifest in the art. This could also be a writing through to get through to something that feels otherwise out of reach. A feeling, a sensation or signal, a thought, someone or somewhere else. One might write with as if joining someone on a walk, involving companionship and coexistence, but also roving, roaming, and wandering. Writing around might be the circling of the thing, the art, or inhabiting its orbits and the other orbits in which it finds itself implicated too. Writing around welcomes tangents and the tangential, spinning, even spiraling delightfully outwards. To write from might suggest a point of departure, but also the position from which the writing takes place, subjective, physical, or otherwise. Much like writing to, which can be turning or pivoting towards, it suggests the intimacy of the epistolary form, whereby a momentary and temporal response might unfold and be enfolded in the letters of a text. By conceptualizing and practicing art writing in this way, I aim to distinguish it from ekphrasis, a literary form dating back to ancient Greece that is often used to describe poetic descriptions of art, usually when it comes to sculptures or paintings. Most definitions of ekphrasis prioritize representation, as seen, for example, in the Professor of English and poet James Heffernan's assertion in 1991 that ekphrasis constitutes the verbal representation of graphic representation. However, as the poet, writer, and translator Sophie Collins notes in her essay, Radical Ekphrasis or an Ethics of Seeing, writing on ekphrasis exhibits as a whole a subscription to patriarchal ideology manifest in its consistent discreditations and omissions of female-authored texts, creative and critical, and the propagation of sexist, even misogynistic language, narratives, and gender stereotypes. My research is thus concerned with art writing as a set of concerns, methods, practices, and orientations that are intent on troubling, eluding, and deviating from the often exclusionary domains of ekphrasis and the ideas of representation to which it has historically been aligned and embedded. In this way, art writing aligns with the idea of discrepant engagement outlined by poet, novelist, and literary critic Nathaniel Mackey in his 1993 work of the same name, which he describes as such. Rather than suppressing resonance, dissonance, noise, discrepant engagement seeks to remain open to them. Its admission of resonances contends with resolution. It worries resolute identity and demarcation, resolute boundary lines, resolute definition, obeying a vibrational rather than a corpuscular sense of being. Mackie extended these ideas further in 2018 through his concept of the paracritical hinge, suggesting a translative project or prospect that draws from the quality of the music known as swing, which he emphasizes as a verb rather than a noun. Mackie describes the paracritical hinge as permitting flow between statement and metastatement, analysis and expressivity, criticism and performance, music and literature, and so forth. It traffics in a discrepant collaborative mix of idioms, genres, registers, dispositions, end quote. Art writing similarly traffics in such discrepant collaborative mixtures, working in tandem with the art object and refusing to conform to extant organizing principles of genre or categorization. It is concerned with the transmission of knowledge rather than its production. It unfurls in the pursuit of resonance, but accommodates dissonance too. It is less interpretive than it is incantatory work, concerned as it is with the capaciousness and uncertainty of encounter. That's me.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. You've opened up more spaces for us already with Max and Cam. So I think we should take a break here, a short mini break for a minute, and we have some time to digest these rich critical spaces. And please put in the chat any comments or questions you have, which we can carry over into our discussions. So let's just take then a minute or so mini break, and then we can come back with Yunqi. Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome back to our second set of presenters. And our first then is from the RCA, and it's Yunqi Peng. Yunqi, are you there?
So hi,
Hi there.
I'm gonna share my screen now.
Okay.
So good afternoon. My name is Yunqi Peng. So could you or okay. So my name is Yunqi Peng. I am a graphic designer and independent bookmaker in the second year PhD candidate at the School of Communication in RCA. Today, I'm going to introduce my practice-led research reconstructing the unofficial in the graphic design of independent art books in the context of book fair and publishing practice in China. Working with art in the form of book has always been seen as a bit of challenge. That's mostly because it requires us to rethink the function of the book, not just as something we read in daily life, but actually as a materiality and conceptual space for artistic practice. So in today's context, two key forms often come up when we talk about the materiality of book in art, the artistic book and the fanzine. These two forms will be the main focus of my research and also the main way I explored and I present my practice. So here are two classic diagrams by Clive Whipper that define and map out the concept of the artistic book. For example, the first one is the really classical one that made three categories of artistic book. It's the combination and the intersection of book object, book art, and literary books. And the book art is actually just the overlapping part of the book object and the literary books. These two diagrams break it down into categories and look at it from different communication perspectives. However, for me, these diagrams are somewhat unfamiliar. They don't seem to be the same as the art publishing community that I am familiar with as a practitioner. So as I went through my studies in different countries, I started to notice that the conceptual map around art publishing exists across the cultural contexts that are different from mine. For example, the word publish can correspond to 5 different words in Chinese. Different languages have different habits of understanding, which make it complicated to direct apply art books and fanzine in English to the Chinese context. In English language discussion, artistic book and fanzine actually are two terms that are differentiated. However, conceptual confusion occurs in the Chinese practice environment. Independent art publishing in China is based on art book fairs and art book stores. In terms of format, it cannot be fully categorized as a fanzine or artistic book. Actually, instead, it's something in between. Besides the cultural context, there's also a practical difficulty that needs to be aware of when talking about the publishing practice in China. So all publications without an ISBN number are considered illegal in China. Meanwhile, the right to issue Chinese ISBN number is actually controlled by the government-owned publishing companies. As a result, a curated model of combining display and sale was created by ABC Art Book Fair in 2023. This has also allowed many independent art publications to legally exist. Here I show two pictures that is from my participatory research. The right picture is from my research of the RCA Art Book Fair in Shanghai as an art publisher in 2023. It is the curating unit in the fair, presenting the practice of bookmaking in a gallery style. The left picture is a table of individual art publishing practitioner. It's my table, which is really similar to the table of the art book fair from all over the world that display in their book work on the table. So based on the Clive Whipper 2 classical diagram I mentioned before, here is an iteration diagram created by me, showing the situation of book under the table at Chinese art book fairs. So as you can see, I try to apply the intersection categorized from the Clive put diagram, and I put the line at the middle, divide the books to two parts. The first part is on the table. The second part is under the table. My participatory practice and the literature review together gave me the definition of the book under the table, which is not physically be put on under the table, but more like a book that will potentially be placed under the table. This type of book used art book fairs in China as a field of practice, and is a book created by one person or small team. The content of the book is highly targeted with a strong focus on materiality and a strong co-creation nature. As a result, it's difficult to get an ISBN to be mass-produced and to be promoted in the mainstream. As a result, it stayed in an under-the-table situation. As a response, my practice-led PhD research draws attention to the design sensitivity of the book under the table as a sign worker in Chinese independent art publishing practice. The physical and material form of the books in a situated perspective is discussed in my practice-led research. Here I show the methodology framework of my research. It is guided by the discourse theory, analyzing the discourse structure in the specific context, and the methodology of interpretative research in qualitative research is leading by a consideration perspective of saturated cultural and political viewpoint. And to collect the data, present the data, and analyze the data, I use three methods. That is participatory action research. I use it to collect the data that is useful for my research. And to present the data, I use visual and autoethnography to present the data and present the as example of my practice work. And to analyze the data, I use critical discourse analyze method to analyze the meaning under the observation of my research. My creative practice actually builds on this observation and provides example of a specific book practice, which is independently initiated by individual practitioner as work of design in visual and format. My research is aimed at discovering how the form of the book shifts when under the table in response to policy restriction and popular perception in China. So here I showed on the screen is my recent bookmaking practice. It is a reconstruction of the text with image structure of the traditional book. I collect all the forms and contracts that a Chinese person born in the 90s will have in their lifetime. This image have a very official and objective design style, but when put into a specific cultural context, the final result will feel more personal, unofficial, and emotional. The image part and the text part of the book are separated, but they can be placed together through the interaction between the audience and me, the practitioner. People can write new story on slip of paper by relating themselves to images in the table, in the book, and this paper slip can be placed onto different pages by different audience. And here is the installation based on the book project I just mentioned. It was also presented at the RCA Research Biennale this year, simulating the table of an art book fair. No reading signs were placed around the table. Meanwhile, a huge number of visitors continued reading the books on the table, ignoring the signs. The no reading signs actually create a paradox of censorship, especially in a situation where there's an official culture. The analysis in my research shows a more complicated situation. That issue is that the ambiguity of censorship practice allows practitioners to believe that their book only needs some self-adjustment and control to become a legitimate practice. Chinese practitioners continue making books, knowing the risk. Readers, in turn, regard this experimental bookmaking practice as entertainment, different from official book because of the involvement of official culture. So under the influence of this habit of thinking, some Chinese practitioners have applied a more flexible approach to the formal presentation of books. So my research contributes to new knowledge in three ways. Firstly, it addressed the gap by identifying, analyzing, and showing the saturated practice of authentic book design in contemporary China. and illustrates the methods, concept, and internal mechanism of the ongoing practice, which is the one-hand research data. Secondly, my situated bookmaking practice aims to gain a general understanding of the communication function of the book under the table, which is a new concept that I mentioned in China. A practice methodology for interpretation and practice that adjusts itself under specific contexts is the potential outcome. The final one is the new knowledge can thus grow an understanding of the communication design style of book under the table and help following researcher to have a more in-depth and diversified understanding of an alternative graphic design strategy and its social semiotic roles in specific environments and political contexts. So here is my saturated discussion of the materiality of books. I am excited to see where it goes from here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Yunqi.
I'm going to.
Thank you. And
Thank
you
you.
set up some more questions there about spaces. Spaces are situations and political and cultural dimensions of those, and obviously censorship is something that I'm sure we'll return to in our discussion. There is some chat already from Steffi. I encourage everyone, please, to contribute to the chat. We move then from Yunqi back to the CVC then, and Joseph, Joe, Rizzo, Naudi. Joe, over to you.
Artwork description, fiction technique and blindness as a generative approach. Pause. Pause. Hello. I'm Joseph, or Joe, Rizzo Naudi, pronounced Rizzo Naudi, and I'm a first-year, techni-funded, practice-based postgraduate researcher at Royal Holloway. I'll be using this synthetic voice to present the first section of this presentation. The second section, which forms the bulk of it, I will perform myself. Let's get started. In the UK, many major art galleries provide artwork description services to make sure that blind people like me are not excluded from their exhibitions. Usually, a professional artwork describer is contracted to write and record short descriptions of a small number of the exhibition's artworks, which are then made available to blind exhibition visitors on a device or online. These descriptions include details of the artwork's visual elements, information about its material composition, and usually some contextual information. They are almost always written in the present tense and from an objective perspective that does not acknowledge the presence of the describer. While these traditional descriptions ensure that blind people are not excluded from the exhibition, their focus on creating an objective, visual-to-verbal translation of an artwork means that the blind person's, my, experience of the artwork is sometimes bland and superficial, and at worst patronizing or confusing. For the people who use these descriptions, the experience is also always marginalizing. Why? Because the experience of listening to a traditionally produced audio description is nothing like the experience of beholding a work of art. They are, as blind scholars say, only pale reflections of the artworks they seek to evoke, in the same way that this synthetic voice is a hollow echo of my own. No offense to you, Microsoft Word synthetic voice. None taken, Joe. Shall I continue? Yes, please. It is important to recognize the work and expertise of many professional audio describers, just as it is important to recognize how many prosthetic tools, such as synthetic voices, enable people across the world, but I think we can do better, or at least, I think we can do more, and, furthermore, the tools, practices and forms for doing better or more already exist and don't require multi-billion-dollar tech investments or the terrible mechanisms of necropolitics.
Joseph, I will now read an artwork description text which uses fiction technique and blind approaches to knowing to create an immersive narrative experience of a photograph. I wrote the text using a recording of a collaborative description conversation held in front of the photograph, which at the time was exhibited at the National Portrait Gallery. The collaborative description conversation involved myself and my supervisor, who both describe as blind or partially blind, and the photographer, who is non-blind. I will now share the photograph and the fiction text on screen and read the fiction text aloud. After the presentation, I will share further contextual details in the chat, including the names of the photographer and the subjects in the photograph. I'm withholding them now in order to increase the tension. Goose, woman, cat. The photograph was in black and white, but mostly it was in shades of grey, as far as I could see. Apart from the goose, the only other bits of white were the tablecloth, which the goose was standing on, and the cat in the bottom right of the frame. It was a white cat lying on the floor, its tail curled around something dark and perpendicular. A chair leg, the photographer said. The cat's tail is wrapped around a chair leg. It's the leg of the chair that Carrie, the owner of the goose, is sitting on, and the goose is standing on the table next to where she's sitting. There was Carrie. She was sitting on the chair beneath which the cat was lying, its tail wrapped around the chair leg. Carrie's right hand lay on the white tablecloth, close to the place where the goose was standing, feet planted, legs straight, with its bold, chunky body and white feathers, and its beak open slightly, as if about to honk. Was this a portrait of Carrie or a portrait of the goose? Or was it a portrait of the cat, or a portrait of the cat's tail as it flicked about the chair leg? When this image was taken, the photographer said, it was one of a series made as he and Carrie moved through the rooms of Carrie's house, she walking with the goose in her arms like a countess, moving through her mansion with a lapdog. She has this connection with the goose, the photographer said. But Carrie wasn't a countess, and she didn't live in a mansion. Carrie lived in a former Chinese laundry. Where was the laundry? In Havana, in Cuba. Carrie's ancestors were Chinese, from Canton, and they'd set up the laundry over 100 years ago. And now that Carrie's children were gone, she lived alone in this large house in downtown Havana, just by the market, just next to the hustle and bustle, just outside of it. And in this room, the room where the photograph had been taken, there was this quietness, the photographer said. Snap your fingers, crisp as anything. The goose was standing on the table, and Carrie was sitting on the chair, and both Carrie and the goose were looking off somewhere beyond the photograph's frame, towards the place where daylight was coming into the room and playing its way across the image, picking out first the whiteness of the goose, then the woman's face, then the cat and its tail wrapped around the chair leg. There was a kind of courtyard out there, the photographer said, and in Havana, these existed in between rooms to keep the air cool. It was an open space where, when this had been a working laundry, the clothes were hung out to dry. Now there was none of that left, the photographer said, but still, Carrie had walked through the house and he had taken photos, and they'd come to the room, and the woman had perched on the chair where she always perched, and the goose had gone on the table where he always went, and the cat had sat where the cat sat, and the moment was captured. Snap. Later, the photographer said, he'd looked at the image and noticed these details. The tablecloth, which was as white as the goose and appeared to hover above the floor. The aforementioned cat's tail as it flicked around the chair leg. The dresser in the background, and on it a doll and a Mickey Mouse mug and bits and pieces and bric-a-brac. Then, on the left, there was the large bottle used for storing cooking oil, a daily necessity, and now, because of the crisis, a daily struggle. Then he'd seen the makeshift cooking space that housed the oil bottle. It wasn't a kitchen, it was too small. And on the wall nearby were some plates, decorative, he said, and on the right there was an empty egg tray, a big tray, for 16 or 20 eggs. Whenever Carrie went somewhere that eggs might be sold, she'd get as many as she could. That was what you did in Havana these days. Everyone did it, the photographer said. When was this photograph taken? Black and white and grey. It could be any time, the photographer said, although the crisis was happening now. The cupboard was bare, the people were gone, there was nothing left. But this had all happened before too, so was it then or was it now? The bric-a-brac on the dresser, Mickey Mouse on the shelf, the doll and the white goose and the tablecloth, and below the woman's chair, the cat, tail flicked around the chair leg. Let me tell you something about that cat, the photographer said, because when I first met Carrie and we went to this room, I saw that this cat was sitting on the stovetop there, and he had all of this dark stuff hanging off the bottom of his white fur, all along his undercarriage. And I said to Carrie, look, I don't want to be rude, but your cat's covered in excrement. No, she said, that's not excrement. He just gets singed when he sits on the stove. It's where he likes to sit. It keeps him warm. And it was like she lived in some kind of fairy tale, this woman, her goose, and the cat who singed himself on the stove. And listen to this, the photographer said, playing a sound clip he'd recorded in the room where the photograph was taken. A gramophone, he said, music playing all the time I was there. And this photo here, he showed me his phone. This is one I took of Carrie. That's her. She's holding a rose. Why? Because when I came back from London to visit her, I'd said, what would you like me to bring you? And she said, bring me a rose. And the photograph is by James Clifford Kent, who's a member of the Royal Holloway CVC research group. And I'm going to post the links if you want to explore that photograph further in the chat, and along with some other references there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe, for that practice. Presentation as practice as performance. Fortunately, James Kent is on the call with us, so we may come back to the specifics of that photograph that you have brought to us. So thank you for that. And we move finally then to our final presenter, back to the RCA and Sean H. Gao. Hi, Sean, over to you. Sean, we can't hear you. Sean, I think you're on mute. Hello. Sean, sorry to interrupt you, but we can't hear you. Okay, I'm going to ask our friends at the RCA to help us here, please. I don't think I'm alone in not being able to hear Sean.
Hello, can you hear us?
We can hear you. Well, not Sean though.
Okay, you hear me before part.
We know we can. Hi, Sean.
Oh, okay. I can hear me.
That's great. Thank you. We still, well, I can't hear. I'm afraid there's something not working there. Sean, Teal, can you help us here, please? There is obviously a problem. Hello? Okay, I'm going to have to ask you, Sean, please just to stop for a moment. Hello?
From 1467 to
You're back.
1487, I think the ball was made several centuries later, actually. This is
Sure.
one friendly real phenomenon, and these can be interpreted as both an act of respect towards past traditions and a statement of equality. Indeed, you can see here how important this is for as evidence providing that unusual phenomenon.
Sean, sorry.
Still can't. Just move that then.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry. We have missed the first minute or so of Sean's presentation.
Maybe it's just my computer. I'm sorry about that.
Let's do that so you're not distracted.
So here's a close look. It's from the Met's main website. Here's another example, similar to the Victoria and Albert Museum. The Met is also using its grand hall to showcase Chinese ceramics and use another room on the top floor to store quotation mark other fine porcelains. What you're seeing here is a porcelain piece titled "Cup with Design of Waves." This piece has also been made at the Yunqi, which is from the Qing dynasty, later than the previous ones. And you can also see the, it's kind of stuck there. The previous picture is the display of this cup, and here's a picture of the bowl itself, the cup itself. Here's some screenshot from the main website here. And you can see that it's only two picture caption and does not actually show what I'm gonna show you here. I don't know if you can see clearly. You can see there are some white lines, maybe not on screen, but some white lines. It's kind of in the underglaze. It's another technique, and it's contributed to the craftsmanship back in days. Okay, so a little bit timeline about myself. I have arrived in the UK last year and starting my PhD practice, and I gradually realized that the framework I had applied was too broad given to the 3 years of research timeframe. So building on that, Chinese art as a description is overall a very massive and also very tricky part to engage. So the intricacy and the vast number of elements introduced and involved made it challenging to achieve a very well done and very well defined research. And also reflecting to some readings and also my internship at the Palace Museum in Beijing, I decided to narrow it down to the Chinese ceramics and only focused on a specific period of time after Song Dynasty and the Peng Dynasty. about museum visits. Over the past few months, I have planned and conducted several pilot visits to the museums in Britain. This includes the British Museum, the Percival David Foundation, the V&A, the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. I have included some images here. As you can see, each museum has its own distinctive approach to presenting Chinese artifacts. For instance, the British Museum adopts a circular chronological approach, displaying its entire collection of the Chinese artifacts along one wing of the exhibition hall. In contrast, the Percival David Foundation, also in the British Museum but in another room, presents Chinese porcelains in a markedly different manner. The gallery holds approximately about 1,700 objects, and unlike the British Museum, of course, it's not followed by the strictly chronological organization, and it's giving more of the color instead of the history. Also, a similar approach is seen at the V&A, which they have a dedicated Chinese room, which was established in the 1997, housed over 600 pieces, and we see two categories, which called collecting and eating and drinking categories, contains the Chinese pieces, porcelain pieces inside. A key question aroused as soon as I decided to focus on the Chinese ceramics and what defines a museum. You can see here in the picture, this is where I took in the mat this year, just last month, actually. It presents some porcelain pieces here, and you can see even in the United States, it has some questions, not as what you have seen before as a showcase room. The left one, you can see the one up front is a little bit discolored, and you cannot see the glaze very well. And the one on the right, it provided a Tibetan bowl, but actually you can see the characters, but not the full length of the entire characters in the back. So this drives to my questions about Chinese ceramics, that what defines a museum, how does the definition evolves, and how they differentiate from countries. Museum definitions. Sorry, my computer. Okay. Museum definitions is hard. Basically, museums are very hard to define, and I'm showing here from the International Council of Museums definition, emphasize on the non-profit permanent institutions and with their own functions. But actually, in China, we have another story to tell. In China, the classification of the museums follows by the framework outlined in the China Cultural Relics and Tourism Statistic Yearbook. This classification reflects a broad approach that acknowledges the importance of history, cultural heritage, and the scientific progress, while allowing flexibility for institutions that do not fit neatly into the traditional categories. In comparing contrasts for the British museums, as outlined in the most recent updated Encyclopedia Britannica, defines 6 distinct categories, and the key distinction is the clear separation between the natural history museums and the science and technology museums. However, in contrast, the United States does not follow a standardized standardized museum classification system. The AAM serves as a leading body for the museum ethics and also guiding some from previous publications of them, which giving some guidelines focusing on the broader institutional responsibilities, include public trust, accountability, etc. So I did something for my Biennale this year, earlier this year, covering the pilot test and also posters about my findings regarding the museum differences. As well as by far, for my first year stage, I covered literature review based on three main categories: the museums and exhibition studies, the museumology and global studies, and the methodology and research gaps. So the first part, the museums and exhibition studies. So Shao has mentioned the primary motivation behind the first museum in China in 1905. That was the urgent need for education, with its founder Zhang Jian regarded as a key factor in the success of the Western societies. Shi's article, on the other hand, served as a key starting point for my engagement with ceramics history, displayed and design. One of the major strengths of his work is that he referenced numerous in-person exhibitions which are difficult to trace actually through the museum websites and their own archive. Liu's article raised another problem, that the structural problem of the support and the shock-proof of the of presenting the Chinese porcelains. This aspect carries significant importance, as the museum she discussed are less commonly examined compared to the foreign institutions regarding the Chinese porcelains. So Liu also emphasized the use of matte acrylic, some measurements considering for the displaying of the ceramic plates, and also the suspension of hanging the ceramic plates on the wall. Moving on to the museumology and the global studies, Bell believed subjectivity is the foundation both in production and the reception, and beyond that, to discuss the accessibility, the materiality, and the discursiveness on both sides is very crucial. Leading to her another argument, ambiguity coexists in the definition and also in the illustration of the collection displays. Japan examines the transformation of the royal collections into the public museums, highlighting the Louvre and the National Galleries as their representative example. A little bit more about my methodology progress. I have adopted the idea of pilot visiting from Ting's thesis. She visited 42 research museums list, and she only limited them to 2 museums specifically in the British to be her case studies. And also for the supplemental exhibits, Shi talks about several important aspects of exhibition design and supportive exhibits that help identify the narratives and the illustration of the exhibits. And also, Li compiled a valuable list of museums that hold significant collections for the Chinese ceramics, serving as an important reference for the planning on-site, for me to plan my on-site research visit and giving a museum list. Moving on to follow-up parts, I specifically want to highlight the gaps. For instance, in some of the term used in both Chinese and English, the translation is not performing that well. For instance, the earthenware, the porcelain, ceramics, and celadon works as actually 4 different but very effective categories in explaining Chinese ceramics. However, they do not perform as the same as what they mentioned, and they don't refer to a very specific category or category of pieces that was reflected on both sides. And also, for instance, the term 陈列展览, generally translated as display exhibitions, in Shishi analysis, we can see that the term display was kind of used as an adjective to describe the exhibition. But however, in Chinese, 陈列 and 展览 is different stuff. I think that is pretty much all of my presentation, and thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for prevailing over the slight tech problems at the start. We got you, we followed you, and that's fantastic. And you've raised questions here about definitions, which perhaps was implicit in all the presentations, but also our definitions can be contingent, obviously, on different cultures and political settings. So I think we should take a very quick mini comfort break, if that's okay with everyone. Maybe a minute so that we don't lose any time for our discussion. There's already some chat and dialogue in the chat, but we'll come back then in a minute and take it from there. Okay, see you shortly.